So this is a very important session, and in this session, Professor Sagnik is going to talk on a very important topic, and the topic is how to publish in a high impact factor journal. So, sir, I want to share with you that we have requested other department research scholars also to join this session so that they can get benefited. Without much delay, I would request Professor Sagnik for his talk. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you once again. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is that give you some of my thoughts on how we can, at least, increase our chances to getting published in high impact journals. Should not say generically high impact journals, but rather how we should publish papers in any journals that have actually high impact later. Because journal impact factor sometimes can be misleading. What I meant to say is that if you publish anywhere, whether that paper is going to impact the field or not. And this is mainly from my experience, editorial experience so far, where I noticed, for example, if you see these 5 journals where I'm associated, they are from 5 different publication. For example, Elsevier, atmospheric environment in one journal, which is quite popular in environmental science. Helion is coming up, which is a cell-pressed journal. Earth System Dynamics is an European Geophysical Union journal. Scientific Reports is multidisciplinary journal of nature. And most recently, I joined editorial board of GeoHealth, which is an interdisciplinary journal of American Geophysical Union. And out of these 5 journals, Helion is open access, atmospheric environment is paper option, and these things matters. In a minute I will quickly talk about it. All EGU journals, if you are familiar, is accompanied by a discussion journal. That means that when you submit a public manuscript to these journals, editorial board goes through it, and if the manuscript seems okay, then it will be first put out in this discussion journal, and you will get a DOI. Then the manuscript will be sent out for review, and because it is a discussion journal, it is open during the whole review process to everyone. So you may get not just 2 review comments, but also comments from anyone. And then you have to obviously accept. So there are different strategies journals are adopting. So with this, actually, I compiled this talk for some other purposes, but I felt that it is quite useful. Let me start with some interesting statistics. This is slightly old statistics. I am compiling some new statistics, but this is again, from our field, atmospheric science. What is the rejection rates of many of the good journals? You can see is listed here. So obviously you can see that the rejection rate varies. In some journal it is quite low. In some journal it is quite high. Obviously, again, some more journals. So somewhere, it varies from 10% rejection to 80-90% rejection. Now, if you see a distribution, mostly you see that the peak is somewhere between 30 to 50-60%. So even with all the disciplinary journals, it's not that most of the papers are getting accepted. In fact, almost the mean is 40% rejection. Now, then The authors, what they did actually, they did an analysis to understand what are the possible factors which are affecting the rejection rates. And again, these are quite appropriate points which I will try to highlight with specific example. First of all, most common cause of rejection is that the narrative is not exciting enough. Or the other important factor is that perhaps the topic is not really suitable for that journal. And this is the case mainly for the multidisciplinary journals. For example, in atmospheric environment, if your manuscript does not have direct chemistry component, usually it is not sent out for review. At least some chemistry, some environmental component has to be there. Similarly, in geohealth, if health part is missing and the interdisciplinarity of that work is not reflected, it will not be considered. And again, it depends on the reviewer's reputation of the journal. Decision making process, which varies from journal to journal. For example, as I said that in discussion, all the journals which have a discussion papers, it's a very different strategy. Versus if you talk about other journals where the decision is made by the editor or the editorial board. In many journals now there is two-tier editorial process. That means it's not just the reviewer, but one handling editor also goes through the review and provides additional comments. And this is now the trend in most of the high impact journals, where in addition to the reviewer, handling editor also provides comments. Now, handling editor also has the power to rule out the reviewer recommendations and suggest otherwise. And then the decision is made by the chief editor based on all these things. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the review process, but this review process is also constantly evolving as the journal ecosystem is changing. What now happens is most of the journal is that you submit. First, there will be checked by the editorial office about the commonality or similarity with published literature. So it is very important to keep in mind that when you are submitting a manuscript, please do yourself this check. If there is more than 30%, then it is high chance that the manuscript will be returned to you, unnecessary wasting time. Then chief editor assigns one associate editor, or those journals which have a different system, that means it has a chief editor and then an editorial board, so it will be passed on to one editorial board member. Then initial decision will be made by the editorial board member or associate editor whether to send this paper out to review or whether to desk reject. Now, many journals have started this desk rejection, which was not the case when I was actually a PhD student. Very few papers during my PhD time were desk rejected. And one of the reason is that because now people are trying, and this is the common case in all high impact journals, they are receiving more manuscripts than they can actually handle. So the reason to reject before review is again lack of clarity in the narrative. If your manuscript is not exciting enough, that means if it is not echoing your novelty, there is a chance that it will not be sent out for review. And this is the most common case if you submit your manuscript to either the journals like Lancet series or PNAS, Nature Sustainability, Nature Communication, Nature Climate Change, those kind of journals. Then you all know that these are the 4 decisions taken: accept, major revision, minor revision, reject. If the journal is publishing only letters means these are innovative work which has a potential to impact the research fields. In letters, for example, if I talk about geophysical research letters or environmental research letters, so in these journals, major revision means reject and resubmit, because the letters, they expect actually the revision to be done in 2 to 3 weeks time. They do not give 2 to 3 months for a paper to be which is the usual case for major revision. So what if it is major revision in those journals, it will be reject and resubmit. Now I have noticed that what happens many times, if a paper is rejected, or for letters if it is rejected and resubmitted, then people try to not take care of the comments carefully and just submit to another journal thinking that somehow it will sneak through, which is very wrong. And there are always lots of things to learn from the overall review process. Many times now we are getting split review. That means somebody, one is saying reject, one is saying minor revision or something else. Then if it is a split review, obviously it will be sent out to third reviewer, take more time. Then you do the revision based on the decision. Either it's a revision or reject, and then if it's a revision, you submit it. Again, from journal to journal, this entire process takes time. Now people are so busy, it is very, very challenging to get reviewers on time. So every journal is desperately trying to get best review possible as fast as they can. Usually, 2 reviewers are what we are all trying to get. But to get 2 reviewers, we have to reach out to at least 12 to 15 reviewers. Then only perhaps 2 people, and then also sometimes we don't get reviewers. Sometimes people accept, then they don't respond. So many times what happens, we have to take decision based on just one review. Although every journal says that they will try to expedite the whole process and all, but you understand that this happens. Now, particularly for student, so this is not in your hand, but what you can do is that if you make your manuscript more or less a quite reasonable one, then this whole process will be the chance is that it will get minor revision. Also, what happens is that students take time to prepare the manuscript. And this is why I advise my own students that this is in your hand, and what you can do is that when you decide, okay, now I'll write a manuscript, from that day when you submit your draft to your supervisor, it could be 1 month, it could be 1 year. If you do a good job in preparing the first draft, obviously you can minimize this time. Otherwise, it will be just back and forth between you and your supervisor in number of iterations. So the question is that what parameters do determine the quality of a scientific article? We all know that it's robustness of research and how clearly you are communicating the message. So now, if you have done a very interesting research, quite robust, but your narrative is not clear. It is not clear actually, the way you explain the results, discuss the implications of the results. It can spoil your good research. So bad narrative can spoil your good research. On the other hand, no matter how good is your narrative or communication, it cannot rescue a very poorly designed research. So equally, both these things are important. You have to find the right balance between the robustness and clarity. Many times what happens, people are submitting manuscripts where without any statistical analysis data are presented. So those kind of manuscripts obviously will earn desk rejection. Any quantitative analysis has to be supported by statistics. So these are very basic things now, but we tend to forget these basic things. So if you ask the question that what steps do I need to really take before I write the first draft, and then how can I ensure that I'm using proper manuscript language, and obviously then build up the whole article. So first thing is that you have to determine whether you have results that advances the understanding in a specific research field, discipline or subdiscipline. As a student, you must develop this ability to determine yourself. Most of the time I see that students completely rely on the supervisors to tell them that, okay, now enough research has happened. You have to become independent. What may happen is that your supervisor may feel otherwise, but then from the discussion with your supervisor, you will learn that where you made that mistake of that judgment. Why your supervisor feels that it's not enough for a publication. But make that decision. Be bold enough to say that, okay, I think now there is enough material. If your supervisor says no, your supervisor definitely will explain why he or she feels no, and you will learn from that process. So what a manuscript has, obviously, either we present some new results or new methodology, or we reinterpret published results, we review. Now, in many review articles, more nowadays, what is happening is that people just summarize whatever is in the literature and present it. Now, that's not a good review article. A good review article must identify the research gaps and then highlight how future research should address the research gaps. Many journals will not accept any review article unless you actually have research gaps and way forward section very clearly outlined. So once you feel that you are ready, then what is required is a strong manuscript. So what is a strong manuscript? Obviously, it should have a very clear, useful, and exciting message. Narrative must be in a logical manner, and this is where again, most of the journals which are most of the manuscripts which usually are submitted from South Asia and other regions, African regions also have seen that many times the narrative of the language itself is not logical. That means so much thing is written actually. Your message has to be very concise. Everyone is busy, so what you are trying to do is that you are trying to convince the editors and reviewers that your research is important. Now, introduction is extremely important, and I have seen actually people write very lousy introduction, because introduction is the section where you have the chance to really identify where the research gap exists and then put the work in the right context. So if your introduction is not clearly written, again it sets a very negative impression. Obviously, you have to decide what type of manuscript you are writing. Is it a full research article, short communication on letters, review article? Each one of these has a very different style in the narrative itself. You cannot have same narrative for all of this. If you are not very sure, it is always good idea, you can get opinions of your peers or colleagues. In many research labs, it is mandatory that before you submit a manuscript, internally you just get it quickly reviewed, in a sense that your peers are just going through it. Here in India, we don't follow this practice mostly because we fear that if somebody else sees my manuscript, an idea may be stolen or not. But always it's a good idea you get an honest opinion in a way that in the same lab, for example, a student has written it. I have started this in my own group. I always see my student that if you have written a manuscript, please show it to others, get a feedback. Because if your friends are able to understand what you want to communicate, that means you have made a good job. Because as a supervisor, I always know that what you have done. It is your job to explain to someone who is not actually doing research in that particular area. Now, again, based on the type of manuscript, obviously, citations depend. If it's a review article, you will definitely earn more citation. Letters also earn a lot of citations. This is one reason which that Sewell's paper identified as main criteria why many papers are getting rejected. That choosing the right journal is extremely important. You have to read the aims and scope of the journal. Do not rely on your supervisor to decide. You can do this job. What you can do is that you go through literature, come up with a suggested 4-5 journals, and then go to the supervisor and say that, look, sir or madam, I have chosen these 4-5 journals. Please suggest which is the best for this particular one. At least this much you should do. Now, if you are not very sure what is the ideal journal for your work, one tip is that you look into the journals from where you have cited the manuscript. So those are the right journals for you. Now, if you are planning to submit your manuscript in a multidisciplinary journal, then the most important thing is that in addition to novelty, they give huge importance on how you are contextualizing the research for the broader readership. You may be doing something in biology, but can people from other disciplines comprehend the implication of your research? And if that is not clear, then obviously, in the multidisciplinary journal, again, the manuscript may not be accepted. So the broad implication has to be reflected in your journals. Then, obviously, as I repeatedly say, language and narrative is extremely important. Now, in many cases, I have seen that English is wrong. There are a lot of typo mistakes. It is your responsibility to ensure everything is in perspective. Now, there are so many different tools available, like Grammarly and others, to do these checks for yourself. If you have too much of these errors, it clearly, you know, raises negative impact on the overall review process. Give importance to clarity, objectivity, how accurately you are presenting the results. And again, a good narrative means your sentence should be direct and short. People have habit of writing long sentences which sometimes get little complicated. Keep in mind that your paper or manuscript will be reviewed by two reviewers. Now, as I said, it is very difficult to get reviewers. So many times it happens that editors may get some peripheral reviewer. That means that the person is not really expert on that particular sub-discipline, but has some broad knowledge. So if your manuscript goes to this type of people, what will happen is that if there is lack of clarity and all, it will create further complications, because it means that it is not getting reviewed by a proper expert. Um, Simple examples which students make mistakes. So this is mainly meant for the students. For example, if you write this sentence, cloud cover is higher in the monsoon season in India. It is not clear. Why? Because higher is a qualitative, subjective word. So if you are saying something is higher in one season, you have to say with respect to what season it is higher. And these are very small things which students do not think when they write the first draft. So your supervisor keeps checking, these sentences and all, and it creates enormous amount of time. Another example, cloud cover increases with aerosol loading. Nothing wrong grammatically correct sentence, but it is not conveying the main message. Are you saying that cloud cover increases with an increase in aerosol loading, or are you saying cloud cover increases with a decrease in aerosol loading? Because both can happen. So this sentence is not conveying the full message. So whatever is the case, you have to be very specific. So this is what I am saying, clarity or brevity. And if a reviewer is reading these sentences, he will get confused. Then again, grammatical mistakes and all are quite common. For students, it is very important that you read the sentence carefully, then read the paragraph, and then read two paragraphs subsequently to see whether you are maintaining a logical sequence in your narrative. Many times what happens, you write some paragraph and then the next paragraph is suddenly starts saying something else. It breaks actually the attention of the reader. Similarly, for example, this is again I've taken from one review. So somebody is written, in this report we have installed a model, or in this one. So clearly, it does not make sense, right? So model you have installed in your machine. So whatever you are writing, think that whether the main message has been articulated. Then you have to structure your manuscript properly. Good title is very important. It has been found that short and catchy titles are often highly cited. Because when people cite some work, there are some statistics where they found that if the title is catchy, because if there are 10 papers on one particular topic, always the short and catchy titles attract more citation. One example here, like in a review process in an LCBS journal, so original title was Preliminary Observations on the Effect of Zinc Element on Anti-Corrosion of Zinc Plating Layers. So then in the review process, the editor suggested that you narrow it down, make it more concise, because zinc is an element, so you don't need to write zinc element. Um, Preliminary observation is not required really. So long title distracts readers. That's what actually the editor felt. And typically, many redundancies can be avoided in the title itself. Abstract is extremely important. It is really an art to write a very concise abstract, because in most of the journals there is a word limit. If you are writing a manuscript for the first time, you will definitely struggle writing the abstract within 300 or 400 words. It never happens. But don't worry. What you should do is that you write and then you try to sort of clean it up. You see which word is absolutely important, which word you can omit. And in this way, you try to reduce it. So you have to develop this art along with your research, that how to write a meaningful abstract. This is where your supervisor helps. But again, these are all important, particularly if you're targeting high, impact journals. Uh, Again, in the introduction, common flow should be that you first identify the broad topic, then you come down to the specific topic. If it's a regional or local studies, then in that particular region, you identify whether studies are done or not. You then very clearly identify the knowledge gap. So most of the introduction fail to identify the knowledge gap and then put the work in the context. Methodology is very, very important, and the most common mistakes what people do is that in the method section they just say this data has been analyzed and stop it there. What they do not do is that they do not explain how the data has been analyzed. For example, if you're showing some climatology, and if you say that, okay, I have analyzed AOD data for this period, that period, but then you're not really describing the process, the statistical part. If it is a trend analysis, what statistics you have done to identify whether the trend is significant or not. So unless these details are there, again, it's a bad sign for the manuscript narrative. All assumptions must be very clearly mentioned. In most of the papers, what people miss is the assumptions, because they think that if I write some assumption or limitations, I am actually bringing out the weakness. But believe me, every technique, every method has definitely some limitations and some assumptions. Results, usually people do not struggle because you just simply are explaining the results. However, what is missing in many of the papers that I am handling is the discussion part. If you are describing some figures, that is not the discussion. Discussion is very, very different. Discussion means once you explain what results you obtain, you must explain the implications for that results. And this implication is usually very poorly written in many of the many of the manuscripts. You can, in fact, make it more structured with subheadings. So the discussion is what makes the difference between an ordinary article and a good article. And in most of the high impact multidisciplinary journals, the decision depends on how good is your discussion section. That are you able to really convince the broader readership about the implications of your work. Figures and tables also some common tips, that many times figure captions are very poorly labeled. Captions should be self-explanatory. Many times multi-panel figures, they are not properly labeled and all. This is a very good resource for youngsters, that what type of graphic requirements journals ask for. You cannot use all types of colors, because nowadays many journals are asking for colors which are suitable for color blind people. So that means specific color coding you can use. And I strongly advise you to move away from Excel and learn some plotting tools, plotting softwares, if you really want to make good quality figures. Conclusion again, do not use obvious statements as conclusions. And reference, obviously, nothing much to add here. Authorship criteria, now it is pretty much standardized across the journals. And last tip is that your cover letter is extremely important, more so for the high impact journals. This is the only opportunity to convince the editor about the importance of your work. Be it very clear that why you feel your paper is suitable, not for that particular journal, but also for the broad readership. What is novel? So maybe this entire paper you can write just one paragraph. I think it should be good enough to highlight the novelty in your work, that what new information you are providing. Even if you are submitting a revised version, try to submit a cover letter. Don't think that cover letter is not required for a revision, because in that revised submission, the cover letter can clearly say that these are the major comments and I have addressed the comments. And this will save actually time for the editor. Otherwise, editor will look through first, then again he or she will decide whether to send it out for another review or not. Plagiarism check and submission you can do yourself. Yeah, so final takeaway that if you really want to make your paper visible among the scientific community, the key takeaways are your manuscript must create a good impression. And if it fails to highlight the novelty, then, as I said, it will not get the due credit. Many times it happens that good research is spoiled just because the paper is not written properly. Because nobody has time to really read line by line. And then actually understand what you want to say. So bad presentations can definitely spoil a good research, but at the same time, as I said, keep in mind a very good narrative cannot rescue a bad research. So that finding the right balance is what you should learn during your PhD. And as I said, that if you start planning properly from the beginning, you can save significant amount of time. And even if a paper gets rejected, do not get disheartened, but learn from the review process, try to improve the paper, then again resubmit. Many times it happens the manuscript has been rejected and then gets published in even higher impact journals. So rejection, acceptance, these are all parcels, but you can sort of follow these common tips and make the process easier for the entire community. So yeah, so if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
I think we can take questions while we go
Yeah,
for the
sure.
lab visit. Thank you once again, Professor Sagnik, for all your time, for a valuable talk. I think it was the most important